Hey, this is Danny Echevarria with theproaudiofiles.com, and I want to talk in this video about some tips to not slam your master bus. Before I talk about that, you might be wondering, why should you even care about that? If you're clipping your master bus in a mix session, can't you just turn down the master fader and call it a day? No, you can't. And the reason for that is that if you are clipping your bus, your master bus, that clipping is occurring before the audio actually hits the fader. So even if you turn the fader down, you're still getting clipped audio. You're just making it quieter, which is kind of two strikes against you because it's both clipped and quieter. So that's not really a solution. And clipping is cool, don't get me wrong. I did a video recently where I talked about ways that you can use clipping to get a kick drum sounding fatter. There's a great article by Matthew Weiss on the Pro Audiophiles site explaining how clipping came to become such a common sound in pop music production and ways that people use it, etc. Worth checking out. But in all of those instances, we're talking about intentional use of clipping, whether it's to add harmonics and saturation or to fatten something up for dynamic control, you name it. There's reasons to use clipping, but it's doing it consciously as opposed to just having your mix come in too hot and so you clip on your master, which is going to introduce distortion into your whole mix in ways that you can't control. So that's going to be a recipe for your tracks coming out sounding not so great. And if you've ever been in that position where you finished a mix, you realized you were clipping, you turned down the master fader by enough that you were not clipping, and then you went out and listened to your car and you wondered why your mix sounded like garbage, maybe you're starting to get an idea why, at least one reason that might be the case. If you're still not convinced, another reason to keep conscious of your headroom while you're mixing and to leave space is that if you're going to send your mix off to a mastering engineer, they're going to have way more that they can do. They're going to have way more to work with if you give them a dynamic mix that has some headroom. If you just give them a totally sawed off waveform where there's, a bunch of audio that's just been clipped off, a waveform that looks like a turd, it's going to sound like a turd. There's nothing they can do with that. So, okay, hopefully you're on board now. You understand that you should stop clipping your bus, and we can talk about how you're going to do that. So my first tip, super easy, is to use pre-fader metering. What does that mean? It means that your meters are going to show the levels of your various channels in your session before you do any volume adjustments on the fader. So whatever the signal level is basically coming off the last insert in the effect chain is going to be what you see on the meter. And it means that you're not going to be able to fool yourself into thinking that you fixed a track that was clipping just by turning the fader down, because like I mentioned before, that clipping is happening before the fader. So in Pro Tools, it's really easy to set that up. You just go to options and choose pre-fader metering. And every DAW is going to have some way to do this, with the unfortunate exception of Ableton Live. I love Ableton. I use it all the time. I think it's a great compositional tool. They don't have this option. And I do feel like I see sessions with clipped master buses coming from Ableton users more often than people on other DAWs, and this might be a reason why. So if you are using Ableton, just know that you can't fix a clipped master by turning down your master fader. And if you want accurate metering, you can look at the metering on the plugins in your effects chain, and those will give you, if not a totally specific representation of where your volume is at, it'll give you something. So, okay, got metering set to pre-fader. Brings me to my next tip, which is to bring down all the tracks in your mix before mixing. What that's going to mean is going to depend on what you have going on in the session. For instance, in this one, I have my drums are all routed to a bus, and on that bus is some dynamic processing, some compression, some tape emulation. So if I change the levels of these individual drum tracks, that's going to affect the way that my drum compressor is working on the bus. So I don't want that. So when I bring all the tracks down, I'm going to bring down the drum bus along with these individual tracks, like these bass tracks are all individual. They're not routed to a bus, these synth tracks. And then the guitars are routed to buses. So I'm going to bring down the buses rather than the tracks because, again, there's processing on the buses. So essentially, I'm going to bring everything down to leave some healthy headroom. So to start, I'm going to pick a loud section of the song, and I'm going to look what my peak is here. So let's take a listen. Okay, looks like I had a peak around -4. So what I'm shooting for is an overall peak for the song around -9. So I got that -4 here. You can see the peak on the master is -3.8. I'm rounding. So I'm going to take, I already have a group made for all the tracks, the buses and the individual tracks, like I mentioned before. And I'm going to turn them all down by, about 5 dB to give me some headroom. And now when I play back, you'll see that we're going to come in around -9. Okay, that was even a little too much headroom. Maybe I'll bring it back a little bit, but you get the idea. So what I've done here is I've created a cushion where as I'm mixing, the levels of these tracks are invariably going to start coming up a little bit. And I'm going to be careful not to let them come up too much. And that's going to feed into my next point, but we'll get there. But even if I am careful about not letting the volume creep up too much, I'm still going to raise average loudness. I'm going to raise perceived loudness on these tracks, and that's going to add up to the overall peak of my song, steadily climbing up as I mix. So giving myself 9 dB of headroom means that it's going to be really hard for me to start scraping the ceiling as I keep mixing. So that's my second tip. The third tip, which goes with that point about not letting the volume creep up too much, is to gain compensate the output of your insert effects. So what that means is if you're using processing on any given track, for instance, a compressor, and I'll use this Kush Silica I've been digging as an example. Where are you? So as I bring up the threshold control on this, it's going to compress more, and the plugin automatically compensates for that compression by raising the output gain. And in theory, that should even things out, but in practice, it ends up actually making the track louder. So what I'm going to do is, after I dial in compression how I like it, I'm going to then look at where my levels went and compensate the output gain so that there's no net change in the volume of the track. And if I look at my drum bus here, it looks like it was peaking around -7. So that's where I'm going to aim to be at the end of all of this. Let's check this out. Okay, so I got, wait for that reverb tail. I got about 3 dB of gain reduction on my drum bus, which is cool, but look where I ended up. The drum bus is now peaking at around -2. So I know I'm going to have to take about 5 dB off the output. And let's see how that worked out. So I would take even a little more off because I was still coming in kind of hot. But you get the idea. This is actually useful 2 times over, not only just because it helps me avoid having the overall volume of my track creep up as I'm mixing, but also because it's a good stress test for this plugin to see if when I take away the volume boost that it's adding, do I still like what it's doing? Because it's really easy to dial in a compressor or any kind of processing that ends up raising the level of a track by a lot and say like, oh yeah, this sounds great. And well, yeah, of course it does because you made it louder. Our ears want to like something more when it becomes louder. So if you can dial in an effect where you like what it's doing and then you still like what it's doing when it's not actually making the track any louder, that's a good sign that you actually made a good processing choice there. Whereas if you do something on an insert effect and then you gain compensate the output and you're like, I'm not sure what this is doing now, that might be a sign that you don't even need it. So this is helpful in multiple ways, and it definitely helps you keep your session from getting too loud. Okay, so this brings me to my fourth and final tip for how not to slam your master bus, which is to carve out space before you reach to turn up faders. So what I mean by this is, let's say I want to hear more vocals in this song. I could just reach for the vocal fader, turn it up, and then I got more vocals, call it a day. But maybe I have a tendency to push it with the headroom when I'm mixing, and I don't want to risk it. So instead of reaching to turn up the vocals, I can think, what's competing with the vocals in this mix? And in this case, it's probably going to be the rhythm guitars, because they are in the same frequency range, more or less, as the vocals are, or at least part of it. So they're going to be competing in that way. And then they're also providing sort of a sustained sound as opposed to a short punctuated sound like the drums are. So the vocals and the guitars are really competing in multiple ways. So I'm going to look at the guitars. I could just turn down the fader here, and maybe that's the right move. But maybe I like the level, and so rather than doing a straight turn down on the track, I'm going to use the EQ on the guitar bus here, and I'm just going to make a bell cut in the range of where the vocal is going to be sitting, which this is a low male vocal, so it's going to be like 100 to 200 hertz. So I'm going to play this back. I'm going to make a cut around there and listen to how the vocal kind of just steps forward. It's not actually getting louder, but suddenly there's this space for it, and the articulation becomes a little clearer. Check it out. All right, let's A/B that. So I'm going to start with this band out, and then I'll bring it in, and you can hear how the vocal kind of clears up in the mix. So that's actually probably a more dramatic cut than I would typically make for this sort of thing, but I wanted it to be obvious what was going on. I really hear the vocal kind of owning its space when I make this cut to make room for it. So not only did I scratch the itch of wanting to hear the vocal better, and did it without raising the level of the vocal and eating into my headroom, but I actually even made more space, created more headroom, because I solved this problem with a cut rather than a boost. So this is kind of like a 2 times over a win in the quest for more headroom and a more dynamic track. Okay, so that's it. Those are the 4 tips. Use pre-fader metering, bring all the tracks down before you start mixing, leave healthy headroom, gain compensate your insert effects, and carve out space before you reach to turn faders up. If you do those 4 things, you're going to find that you have more dynamic mixes with more headroom. You're going to stop clipping your master. You're going to stop hearing that unwanted distortion, and you're going to make your mastering engineer a whole lot happier. So once again, I am Danny Echevarria with theproaudiofiles.com. You can find me at dandestiny.com. Happy mixing, everybody. Peace.